There we go. PowerPoint is up there. We're going to learn, first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about some sciencey stuff, and specifically how unconscious thought influences our physical behavior. And this is critically important in terms of political communications. And we're going to look at why that matters very briefly. Then we're going to look at two important economic issues in the United States and Wisconsin. The first one is infrastructure investment. There's a lot of talk about us investing in infrastructure because of deficient bridges, the Amtrak incident that happened out east. And then in terms of the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, WEDC, which has been a very hot topic in the news today. And more importantly about that is looking at the consistent frames and values about those two issues and how we can pivot those to change public discourse. So, unconscious thought is much more critical than we previously thought. Traditional psychological knowledge was that unconscious thought was merely repressed conscious thought. So it was merely things that you repressed until they became conscious or until they were made conscious through therapy and things like that. We're now understanding that that's not true. First of all, it accounts for 98% of your brain activity, which any of you who have had a workshop with me, I say it a lot, but it's always worth repeating that 98% of your brain activity and thought is unconscious. Now, why is that important? Because what we're finding out is that your brain actually changes thought and perception pre-consciousness to fit existing frames and knowledge that you are previously not aware of. So, or sorry, that you are only unconsciously aware of. So, for example, if you are experiencing something in the world, and before you become consciously aware of that experience and what's happening, your brain will filter and change your perception of that experience to fit your previous knowledge and existing frames that you are operating in. So very important. And along with that is this idea that all meaningful thought that you have is embodied. And then, of course, because of how your brain changes thought unconsciously, it's derived from existing knowledge and frames. So everything you understand about the world is connected through previous knowledge. Very important. And this actually matters very much in political discourse and communications. And we're going to see how here, this is a video, very recent, this is from March, of George Wittkopf giving the keynote address at the the Association of International Psychological Society in March, and this was in Amsterdam. Cue up the video here. He talks about the importance of unconscious thought, and I have the videos turned up high on my end, so you may need to fiddle with your volume if they are a little soft. So here we go.
Most thought is unconscious, and the usual estimate is around 98%. But if you believe the work that Stan DeHaan talked about the other night, it's more than 98%. Consciousness is the tip of the iceberg of thought. And it is there that things are put together in an interesting way. And the interesting way is the following, that before consciousness, what happens is that your brain unconsciously changes what you perceive or what you think. And this is something remarkable. I think one of the best papers I heard on this was by Shin Shimojo, who's a vision scientist at Caltech. And he came to Berkeley a couple of months ago and gave a truly remarkable overview of experiments that show this, many of which were his. Let me give you a sense of this. Suppose you know that if there are flashing lights and they're going along and they're going fast enough, they look like a single stream. No problem, you all know that. But if the same thing happens with touch, so you have little machines that will touch you along your arm very closely, very quickly, and it'll feel like someone's stroking your arm. Fine. Then they set the machine to hit you here and then underneath the first one and then to the right of the first one. And what you feel is the second one, not underneath, but in the middle. That is, you don't feel what was actually done, you assimilate it to a pattern you already know. And that means not recognizing what was presented to you on your arm through touch, but only representing something that, and you feel on your arm, something that was not touched there. Okay? This is like the McGurk effect, which I'm sure you probably all know, and if you don't, you didn't take a phonology course. Basically, it goes like this. You have a picture, a video of someone saying ba, and the same person saying ga. And you show those, and then you show the picture of him saying ga while he sounds like ba, right? That's what people are presented with, and what they hear is da, with a D, which is in the mouth in between. It's the same thing. You're creating something that was not either presented to you visually or orally, and you're hearing something that wasn't there, right? And this is completely normal, and it happens in other kinds of cases. There's a classic case where they present you with a black dot, and underneath the black dot there's a flash that moves to the right. What people see always is next to the black dot, the flash is to its right that moves to the right. It's not underneath. And if you tell them that, they still see it that way. And then the same thing happens in another case. There will be a beep and a flash at the same time. There will be two beeps and a flash with each of the beeps. Fine. Then there's two beeps with a flash with the first beep, and people see two flashes. And then you tell them that this is the case, and they still see two flashes. Right? This is perfectly normal, and it happens in politics, which we'll get to, I hope.
So there we go. It happens in politics. As any of you who have heard George or attended a lecture with me or a workshop, you know it happens in politics. So getting back to the PowerPoint here. So what's important about that? Why does that matter for politics? Well, it's because your brain does these unconscious things. As George said, it uses existing information to fill in knowledge gaps, and it actually changes your thought and perception of your experiences unconsciously to fill those knowledge gaps. And what it does is it goes back in time to the strongest circuit. Our sense of linear circuits neurally is very strong. So it makes sense that your brain would fill in knowledge gaps with the idea of a linear, for example, a linear touch or perception of linear experience. In politics, as we know, the conservative frame is the strongest today, and therefore people repeat and reinforce conservative messaging even without conscious thought. So I did notice some people joined in a touch late, and the Q&A mode is active. So if you have a question, there is an Ask a Question button, and you will line up in the queue, and then I can activate your voice, and you can ask your question, and then I can kind of help control any questions that go on since there's multiple people on this webinar. Or you can also enter a chat question or a comment down in the little chat area down towards the bottom of your screen, not the large box, the narrow rectangular box at the bottom. So, moving on. So there are some examples all over the place of how conservatives, progressives, the media, just people generally reinforce these conservative ideas and strengthen them through language and expression of ideas and vision. And it has everything to do with this unconscious changing of perception before it becomes conscious. And here's a good example of that, getting to the infrastructure, investment, and privatization issue that we're looking at tonight, in that context nationally and then in terms of WEDC. So here's a video. This is the Economic Innovation Group. Cory Booker is in a kind of a little bit of a roundtable session here, but you're going to hear him talking about kind of what he envisions and perceives as being important about investment and the economy. So.
Persistent, indefatigable emphasis on training and education. You know, if you take just the top 10% of the graduates from Chinese high schools right now, just their elite of the elite, they outnumber in total all the children in America. I mean, this is a profound competitive world. We're in a global knowledge-based society, the greatest natural resource of any nation.
If you look at the OECD data on American investment in sort of K through 12, it's pathetic. We're one of the last, if not the last, in those investment levels.
But I love looking at indices of competitiveness.
Do your colleagues in the Senate know that?
I'm sure we're all data-driven people, but that's OECD.
They're not all data-driven people.
The World Economic Forum all create indices on competitiveness.
Right.
This is why, in many ways, Jack Kemp was one of the more inspiring figures for me when I was coming of age in college, because he really talked about just pragmatic competitiveness. And we're falling on all these indices of competitiveness globally. Investments in infrastructure, percentage of graduation. So I really want to emphasize that Tim is right when he is passionate and emphasizing the urgency of the now. We can't afford to have in fact, if you look at the 20% of our children in America that are born poor, and poverty in America is a trap, it's quicksand, only about 8% of those kids, or less than 8% if I have it right, are going to end up going to college. It is unconscionable in this country that believes in equal opportunity that we are not giving those kids education. But I do want to just mention that model that you talked about that was introduced reflects this Jack Kemp idea that if you know how capitalist systems work, you should be doing things that move with that flow and empower investment in a rational way. And I just see a lot of exciting things from my experience with trying to get investment into Newark that could help put wind at the back of investors in a way that produces a tremendous return, increases that economic ecosystem. And then the last thing I'll say, because I know we're running out of time, but it is such an important point because it gets back to these process issues. One of the things that is inhibiting our nation's global competitiveness is our inability for our government to seize upon ideas that work.
Really interesting there, the kind of expressing how we should, this idea of expressing how we should bring up poor people and provide them opportunity, but expressing that in the conservative frame. A really interesting perspective there from someone who is a Democrat, and demonstrates how powerful this framing is in terms of your unconscious thought changing what is conscious, and in Cory Booker's case, what he considers rational. And let's just take a look at that. Back to the slide here. He talked about a competitive world, the idea of pragmatic competitiveness. Competition is very soundly and firmly in the conservative frame. How is it that's the case? Because in the competition, the moral and disciplined people will win and be elevated up, and the undisciplined immoral will lose, and therefore they deserve their loss, they deserve their poverty, and of course when they become disciplined, they will no longer be in poverty. So there's that. this concept of move with the flow and empower investment in the capitalist private system. There we start getting into this idea of how capitalism and the private investment creating wealth is moral, is actually consistent with conservative values. And again, our investment in infrastructure, in this case, should empower the investors. He talked about empowering investment in a rational way. Common sense rationality these days is that the investors make money. The important thing with the investment in infrastructure is the return to the investors in terms of the private sector. He talked about the wind at the back of the investors, creating that metaphor. Make it easy for them. That means get rid of government regulation, get rid of bureaucratic red tape. You've heard all the metaphors before. And then this idea of tremendous return for investors and how government is dysfunctional by not being able to seize on these private ideas that work. Really important. The idea that government is immoral, that government will only mess things up. We need to get government out of the way. So how does that relate to what's going on with the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation? Let's make the connection here through framing and also demonstrate to you how powerful this is, even in progressive media. So Tom Hartman is if you've listened to him, he's a very intelligent, he's very factually oriented. He pretty much always has his facts right, or he doesn't say them at all. And here he is, he's talking about, this is just from late last week, he's talking about the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, and I want you to pay attention to the phrases he uses, the language he uses, what that evokes, and then how he presents the progressive, let's say progressive argument in terms of what's going on in Wheaton. So here's Tom Hartman.
In the beginning of the last hour, I went off on a rant about how Scott Walker has run his state, Wisconsin, into the ditch. He inherited a $1 billion surplus. He's now looking at a $2 billion deficit because of his tax breaks for rich people and for big corporations. And now he's looking to cut hundreds of millions of dollars out of the state university system to pay for his tax breaks for rich people and big corporations. But now Alice Olstein posted, it just went up over at the Center for American Progress's blog, Think Progress. It gets even weirder than that. I mean, this is Republican politics at its very worst. And the fact that every American doesn't know this story this is American media at its very worst as well. The Walker set up this thing called the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation back in 2011. And the goal of this thing was to take taxpayer dollars, to take money that Wisconsin citizens, voters, taxpayers had paid to the state in income taxes and other kinds of taxes, to take that money and give it to private corporations. Now, the theory was if you give money to private corporations, state money to private corporations, they will create jobs. Now, for some reason in Wisconsin, Scott Walker and his Republican buddies think that if you give money to poor people, they don't create jobs, right? They're from drug testing benefits to now, they want to pass this law so that, they super monitor what every single person spends their food stamps or TANF or whatever it may be, their benefits on. So just follow this logic for a minute. They're saying if you give money to the corporations and the rich people, they'll create jobs. But we don't want to give money to poor people. The reality of economics, and this is why Wisconsin's economy is going down the tubes. This is why Kansas's economy is going down the tubes, because Sam Brownback is peddling the same kind of Reaganism nonsense. The core essential message of basic economics, and you can read this in 1776 Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, David Ricardo in 1817. I mean, this is not new. Or Paul Krugman today. The basis of the basic thing that drives economies is demand, is people buying things. In order for people to buy things, in order to have demand, people have to have some money. So if you want to create jobs in Wisconsin, increase your minimum wage and increase your food stamp benefits for really poor people. They will spend more money in the local stores. The local stores will then, have to hire more people to help out. They will be selling more products. If those products are made in Wisconsin, then that's more manufacturing for Wisconsin. If those products are made in China, well, that gets us into a whole rant about our lousy trade.
Okay, so you get the idea of where he was going with that. And what's really important about that is that, look, as I said before, Thom Hartmann is a very smart guy. He gets his facts right. He knows what he's talking about. And so even though everything he said was factually accurate, what's really important is again, what we talked about in the first part, this idea of how your unconscious thought changes your perception prior to it becoming conscious. It influences your physical behavior. Clearly, Thom Hartmann understands the systemic nature of the economy. He talked about it in great factual detail, about how people who have more income will spend more into, for example, a state economy and provide for more economic participation for everyone. Right. We all get that. We all agree with that. But what's important in terms of cognitive science and framing is this idea that facts are meaningless when the conservative frame is evoked. And why is that? Because if the facts don't fit the frame that a person is operating under, perceiving, remember the unconscious, changing your perception of the world to fit your frame before the thought becomes conscious, as we talked about earlier, that is critically important, because if the facts don't fit that frame, that linear thinking, then you reject the facts to preserve the frame and that linear way of thought. So just looking at some of the initial things that Thom Hartmann said, the very first thing he said about Wittkopf is something that is very common in the media. It's everywhere. The idea that you give public money to private corporations to create jobs. That right there evokes the conservative frame on multiple levels. The idea, first of all, is that of private corporations creating jobs. We're going to talk about the whole job creation thing coming up, but that's a metaphor. It doesn't really exist in the real economic system, the real economic world, as Thom Hartmann was pointing out. Private corporations don't just create jobs out of thin air. There's something going on there. We need to talk about it all the time. And this connects with what Cory Booker was talking about in terms of investment in infrastructure. Okay. The other thing in that sense is give public money to private corporations. Okay. That is an idea that fits the conservative frame. Okay, we're going to get to why in a second. If you've experienced a Wittkopf lecture or been to one of my workshops, you'll have an idea of why that's the case. Okay, then Thom goes on and he talks about this idea of create jobs. Well, that is classic negation. So it's classic negation in the sense that he's saying it somewhat facetiously. Of course, poor people don't create jobs, but he's saying it to try to negate the idea that is so ridiculous about giving public money to private corporations. So it really, again, just reinforces this conservative frame of job creation. He then proceeds to talk about the reality of economics in terms of pretty much straight out facts, right? He talked in detail about demand in terms of economics. He talked about the systemic nature of income and things like that for people to, to be better participants in the economy and more prosperous themselves. Again, in the face of the frame that he established with his original statements, the facts are virtually meaningless. Later on in the video, he goes on to talk about specific grants that WITA gave out, and specifically why they were questionable and why they were not good decisions in terms of loaning money. So what's important about that? It's this idea that in a conservative frame, corporations and the wealthy are disciplined and moral, very moral, and they deserve their wealth. Right? So in many respects, in the conservative frame, those private corporations deserve that public money as a result of them being moral and disciplined, because they're going to do what's best with that because they're moral and disciplined. The other thing that's important is that on the flip side, people who are in poverty, people who are poor, are not disciplined and are immoral, and therefore the poor people deserve their poverty. And more importantly, the public is immoral. The public is immoral in the sense that it impedes personal liberty to pursue private success, which is what this whole idea of, again, investment and economic development is all about. So we need to change that frame. This is really important that we start changing economic discourse. And there are some precedents for this. Thomas Piketty, in his book, Capital in the 21st Century, is talking about that. The systemic nature of inherited capital and how it's contributing to income inequality generationally. So let's look at some ideas that we can talk about in terms of a progressive vision for a systemic economy. And one of the important things about the differences between the progressive and conservative frame are these ideas that conservatives depend on direct causation. So in everything in the conservative frame, there has to be direct causation. So schools are failing, teachers are terrible, unions protect bad teachers, that's why kids are not learning. People who commit crimes are bad and immoral, and they should go to jail. In terms of economy, right? So private sector, the wealthy, are the job creators. If we just free them up to do their thing, then we will have this prosperous, flourishing economy for everybody. Direct causation. Progressives, on the other hand, have a challenge because we need to talk about a systemic economy. And here's some ideas on doing that. And I would encourage you, if you have comments, enter them in the chat area. The ask a question is open in the Q&A, so you can get in the queue to respond, ask a question, make a suggestion or something like that. So to change conscious physical behavior, we need to present new ideas and vision for a systemic economy. The first one is we have to start defining what a corporation is. And just saying corporations aren't people isn't good enough, because that's negation. It actually reinforces the metaphor of corporations as people. And we have all sorts of ideas and metaphors in common discourse that reinforce the idea of corporations as people. We have ideas that corporations can be moral. They can have feelings. They can behave in the same way as individuals. Of course, this is all metaphorical and largely not true. So here's how we can change that. First of all, point out that a private corporation is a form of governance. And that form of governance, unlike the public, has one purpose, and that is the pursuit of profit. Okay, that's step one. Step two is that the public, government, all of us acting through our democracy, the purpose of the public is to protect and empower people. Okay, two very different purposes there. Extremely different. So the corporation in the economy hires workers to do what? To create profit for the corporation. Right? No corporation hires a worker because they are just nice people. Just because they woke up one morning and decided to be benevolent and hire people. No. They hire people because it will contribute to their profit. Extremely important. So then we get to this idea about profit, because profit is not immoral. Think Elizabeth Warren. You can make profit in our economy, and that's great, as long as you take responsibility for your employees, for your community, for the things that you receive through the public, and pay forward through that social contract for future generations. A critical idea. People who work in Wisconsin, all people who work, are profit creators. And as such, they have a moral right to a fair living wage portion of profit which they themselves have created. So critically important to start talking about people who work, whether it's in construction, whether it's in fast food, whatever it is, that they are profit creators for the corporations and the people that they work for. And therefore, they have that moral right to receive a fair living wage so that they can pursue a meaningful life. It's a very simple definition of freedom, only in the progressive frame. So in terms of the public, so here's where the public comes in. Okay, the moral role of the public in this relationship between let's say ownership and employee, or management employee, or corporation worker, is the public has an obligation and a moral responsibility to protect the people, protect the profit creators from corporate greed, and then empower those profit creators, the people, to pursue a meaningful life, which, again, they cannot do unless they are receiving a fair living wage portion of profit. So in terms of this systemic ideas and the systemic economy, think of it this way. The bottom line is what we're doing is activating empathy. The idea that we have a responsibility for others as ourselves. And when we do that and use this effective language and evoke these progressive ideas, we can change the conversation. We can change what people are perceiving unconsciously, to not be talking about the virtue of the market and the virtue of the job creator and this idea of direct causation. But we can start pointing out the systemic nature of our economy, our communities, and our society. So most importantly, one of the things that I would really underscore, and have been for quite a while, as has Dr. Wittkopf and others, is the rejection of the metaphor job creator. Okay? Rejected as a fiction. It is a metaphorical creation by conservatives very effectively to evoke this idea of direct causation and the idea of the virtuous market and the virtuous job creator, that completely keeps the public as being not only out of the equation, but immoral and has no place in the equation, except for the public's role to, as Cory Booker put it, be the wind behind the investor class, so that they have the liberty, the personal liberty to invest and get a significant return on their investment for what they do to create jobs. Never acknowledge that metaphor again. Start changing the conversation to being that the people of Wisconsin, the people of the United States, the people of our community, whatever it is, are profit creators. Because the job creator thing is a fiction. It denies fundamental truths about the systemic economy. And when we talk about framing, what is the fundamental role of framing? It is to provide context for fundamental truths so that they can be accepted. So to finish here, I know you all want kind of starting messages and ideas to start riffing on, to start building on. And through a lot of the workshops I've been doing recently, this is a message in the progressive frame that has come up a lot. And it's really interesting how you get 30, 40 people in a room, 20 people in a room, and you break out into groups and you have them do some woodshedding on coming up with messages on different issues. How often, independent of anything, it comes back to this kind of core idea that in our communities or in Wisconsin or in our nation, in whatever, we take responsibility for each other. It's a very simple phrase, which if you repeat it over and over, and you can connect it to some of these kind of sub-messages, which I put here, to protect people from corporate greed, to empower people to live a meaningful life, to live in healthy communities, to enjoy nature's beauty. It can connect to all sorts of different issues very, very effectively. So this is kind of a fun thing here. I'm going to pull up the whiteboard, which is, it can be collaborative. I'm going to click the collaborative so you can all, there's a text if you want, there's drawing in the left-hand toolbar. I just have thoughts if you have specific questions regarding those basic, that basic framing there. Other things that we can do is have discussion on the website in the discussion forum, exchange emails, things like that. In terms of doing some networking and perfecting of these messages in terms of specific issues so that we have consistency. So obviously if there's any questions, feel free to, I'll just do a quick, so you can type here, something like that, if you like, or ask a question. Wow, I must have been really thorough. Holy cow. Okay. Give it just a minute, just in case. Okay. Well, I'll put that up to conclude here. So thank you all for attending and coming on the webinar. This is the first one. Feel free to send suggestions through the website. I'm sure all of you have my email address by now. Suggestions, things you'd like to see covered. See you in 1 month for the webinar, and the next Thinking Forth Journal will be sent out next Tuesday. So thank you very much, and this concludes this webinar.